All right, these next three sections are really easy to understand and edit, which is why we are starting out with them. The first one is the flight tuning section, and these are just scalars. As you can see on the default Caravan, they're all set to 1.0, and these are nothing more than scalars of certain things in the air file. So, parasitic drag scalar. The actual amount of parasitic drag is defined in the air file, but you can scale it here, and this is a good way of fine-tuning certain aerodynamics. So this is also one of the reasons why you probably see developers not utilizing multiple aircraft in one folder like we talked about earlier, is because these will apply to all versions, so it's a little bit more difficult to fine-tune everything. But basically what this is just a scalar. It's normal. 1.0 is 100% normal. Anything less than 1.0 and then that thing is less effective. More than 1.0 and it's more effective. So if I increase this to say 1.5, that is 1.5 times more effective than normal. So it would have more parasitic drag. Conversely, 0.5 is less parasitic drag. Now, I don't think you can enter negative numbers here, but presumably if you could, they would reverse the effect of that. Now, that's pretty straightforward. The second thing here is airplane geometry, and most of this is for reference purposes. This is here for add-ons to be able to read, as well as there's very little of this actually comes into the sim. Almost none of it. Actually, none of it even come into effect with the physics. So this here changes nothing, but you're basically defining like the wing area, wingspan, wing root chord, stuff like that. Now, the only time this comes into effect is when parking at a parking spot. The ATC engine looks for parking spots based on 1/2 of your wingspan. So parking spots are defined by their radius. Let's say your average small parking spot's about 32 feet wide. So it will take the wingspan, multiply it by 0.5 to get half of what the wingspan is, and it will look for parking spots that are bigger than that. That way you don't see, ideally that means you don't see big airplanes parking in spots meant for smaller airplanes. It doesn't seem to always work, because I always see not Global Express, but I always see Gulfstream aircraft parking in spots intended for single engine Cessnas. So it doesn't always work. Maybe I need to look at those Gulfstreams and see if this data is entered correctly, because that's the one thing I can think for it to affect. But all this is pretty straightforward. You can just read it. A bit of a note here, usually default CFG files will have this extra stuff on the line over here, and that basically is just a copy of the example, or no, the description in the SDK, and it just tells you what that does, pretty much. You don't see that in add-ons too much. The only other one I can think, the stuff that actually affects anything, would be stuff like this down here. Like spoiler extension time, are spoilerons available, aileron to spoileron gain, minimum aileron, spoiler handle, auto spoiler, stuff like that. And the last section is just the reference speeds. So flaps up stall speed, which I believe is VFE. No. VSO. That's it. No, wait, VS1, because VSO is stall dirty. So flaps up stall speed is VS1, and full flap stall speed would be VSO. Cruise speed, Mach, and max indicated airspeed. These are all just references. They don't really affect anything in the sim. They are just there for add-ons to be able to read them. And that is basically it. That's a quick and easy section. The next one, however, is the weight and balance, and that's going to require a decent amount of time explaining, because this is a very important section right here. Alright, so the weight and balance section. This is where we defined the weight of the airplane as well as the payload stations. So, real quick, the way Flight Sim works with weight and balance is you define exactly where the payload stations are, and then the end user in Sim can add or remove weight to those stations, and that affects the CG. So, we need to define a few characteristics of the plane. Usually, it's going to ask for this in the same order. I think most add-on devs tend to copy a default CFG file and then change various information to suit the plane they're making. So, usually this follows the same order. This first number up here, this is the max gross weight of the plane. So, what's the maximum gross weight? What's the heaviest the plane can weigh and still fly? You typically want to put either max gross weight, max takeoff weight, or maximum ramp weight here. Don't mess up and put max landing weight, and really don't put max zero fuel weight, because you will never get the plane off the ground then. So that one's pretty obvious. The next one's also pretty obvious, is empty weight. What's the empty weight of the plane? Now, this can be a bit tricky because be careful which weight you're defining here. This wants to know the empty weight of the airplane. That is the weight of the plane, unremovable items, unusable fuel, and I think oil too. Sometimes I see definitions without oil. Really, you want to put the empty weight here, or be careful between the difference between empty weight and operational empty weight, because they are very different. Empty weight's the empty weight of the plane, nobody on it, just a straight empty weight. Operational empty weight is the empty weight of the plane with the flight crew and required items on board. So be very, very careful about which one you enter. If you use operational empty weight here, do not add flight crew and cabin crew to the sections down here. Conversely, if you don't use operational empty weight here, you need to add flight crew and cabin crew to these stations down here. Now, the reference datum position, we've sort of already defined, but just as a quick reminder, this is where you define the datum reference point. If we look at our POH for a 208, we can see the reference datum point is right in front of the prop on this diagram, so it's probably safe to say this POH is defining the tip of the prop cap as the datum on this plane. So all weight and balance data is relative to that. And in the aircraft CFG, everything is relative to that. Now this is the empty weight CG position. Where is the CG located when the plane is empty? This is important to know so Flight Sim can make the appropriate CG calculations. Now, maximum number of stations, 50. I recommend setting this to a high number for now. When you're testing the plane before distributing it, set this to a high number. When you're done testing and you've got all your station data fine-tuned and everything, then you can set it to a lower number or the exact number. Now, what this tells the sim is how many stations are there. You can actually have as many stations as you want, but Flight Sim's only going to pay attention to this number of stations. So let's say I had 3 stations, but put 2 here. 2 max stations. It's going to pay attention to station 0 and 1 and exclude station 3. It's not going to pay attention to the last stations after the maximum. Why exactly is that there? I don't know. I can't think of too many uses for it, but there you go. Now, these are the stations. Now, these are presented in 2 different ways usually. Either this method, which is how the default planes use it, or you have the station info and then the station name in a separate section down here. So station load 0 equals data, and then station name 0 equals the name. Alternatively, you can also put the name up here and it will recognize it. Some aircraft do it that way. Go with whichever one's easier for you. I typically go with whichever one the CFG file is using, because the weight and balance data is a section of the CFG file where most devs mess up. Very, very rarely do devs get this right. And by far the most common problem is either stations not located where they should be on one of the axes, or yeah, or not enough stations or things like that, or the stations aren't right for their chosen layout. I've seen devs be really crazy with this. Like, there's been stations that are way up here or way down here or not aligned at all. So what you actually want to do, we can use AI Aircraft Editor's model viewer to help us out here. Now you see this magenta square right here? This is actually the weight, one of the payload stations. You can see another one back here. Let's read this real quick. We got station 0 equals 170 minus 11.3 minus 1.5, 0.0. Station name is pilot. So that defines where the pilot sits, basically. So we want to stick that right smack dab on the seat, and as you can see, that's where it is. If you look carefully, you can kind of see it there. So that one's already defined. Now I've already set this one to be 0. It's actually really helpful to set a station there temporarily to be all 0. That way you know exactly where the datum is. And I highly recommend that when you are testing the plane. Have at least one payload station during your design and testing phase that is exactly where the datum is. That's also useful if you're going to do cabin crew, for example. Now, we need to define the payload stations, and to do that, we need to know what the cabin configuration is. As discussed in the C208 tutorial, the Caravan actually has many different cabin configurations. There's 2 different passenger cabin layouts. There's the cargo layout, and then there's the hybrid cargo-passenger layout. So which one does the default Caravan use? Well, if we go to textured view, we can actually look in the windows, and if we hold down Shift and use the mouse, or is it Alt? Shift, right-click. Okay, Shift and right-click, we can actually translate the camera around in the 3D viewer and zoom right in here to the cabin and see we have passenger layout with 2 seats on one side and 1 row of seats on the other, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4 rows going back, so 3, 6, 9, 12 seats total, plus the 2 pilot seats. Caravan actually can operate with 1 pilot, so it's up to you. You can choose this to be the co-pilot seat or use it as a passenger seat, one or the other. If it's helpful, you can also use this slider up here to play the animations forward so you can get a better look in there. So we can actually use the POH. This other square here is where my datum is, and that's about where the datum appeared on the POH. So we can actually directly use the POH data to define this. So here is the cabin layout right here that the default Caravan uses. If I rotate clockwise, we can see the actual arms in inches. So we just have to convert this to feet. So right here are our pilot seats, and they are at 135.5 inches aft of the datum. So 135.5 divided by 12 inches per foot, that's 11.2. If we look at our CFG file, 11.3. It's right where it should be. Okay, so let's go over these numbers real quick. This first number here is the weight of the station. You put however much weight is there by default. That's what the plane's going to spawn with and what it's going to have in the payload dialog if the user doesn't change it. Remember, the user can change this, so you just put however you want the plane to spawn. These next few numbers are the position data, and we have longitudinal axis, lateral axis, vertical axis. So real quick, longitudinal axis, if I switch back to wireframe, from the tail to the prop, straight down the spine of the plane. Lateral axis, from wingtip to wingtip, left or right. And vertical axis, from the wheels to the tail, up and down. Now, you define these in X, Y, Z coordinates. So 11.3, if it's a minus, is aft of the datum. If I can get that right. 11.3, yeah, aft of the datum on the x-axis. And 1.5 is a negative number here, so it's 1.5 left of the datum. and 0.0 is even with the datum. I'm kind of making it sound more confusing than it is. It's actually pretty simple. XYZ coordinate system. And I'm going to show you two ways of doing this. I'm going to show you the way you can do it when you have access to the POH, and the other method, which is how you're probably going to end up doing it most of the time. So real quick, we're actually just going to set up another station to mirror the pilot station. And this is going to be our co-pilot. So real quick, actually, I'll show you how to do it the other way. I'm going to change the pilot load data to 175. I recommend using 175 pounds per person, particularly if you use SimBrief, because that is the weight SimBrief uses. So whenever you put a person somewhere, assume 175 pounds for one person and 55 pounds for baggage. That's the weights SimBrief uses. And that's what I recommend going with. So that's what I always go with. So we're going to set up the co-pilot station to mirror the pilot station. So we want it in the exact same position on the longitudinal axis. However, for the lateral axis, we actually want it opposite. See how this one is negative 1.5? We actually want this one to be 1.5. Now, these numbers here, if you want, you can try to keep them in the same lateral alignment here. This uses Courier new font on the CFG file, so each character takes up the exact same amount of space. So using spaces, if you want to help keep these things lined up, is recommended. The sim will ignore spaces anyway, so don't worry about that. And vertical axis is fine, 0.0. Now, if I save my CFG file, close the model viewer, and then reopen it, you can see it's put the new station there, right smack where the pilot is. Now we can actually see that they're not quite where they should be. It should be a little closer to the line here. So let's actually put these in the right spot. I think about a 1.3 would be more accurate. A quick note on decimals. These numbers are in feet, which means the decimal is in inches. So please don't get too crazy with them. I've seen people go up to like the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7th decimal place here. And there's really no need for that level of accuracy. One decimal place will work. Because remember, this is in feet. So your decimal is in inches. There's 12 inches in a foot, right? So 1.2, I guess you could put the 5 there if you want because that's a quarter, but 1.2 is close enough. That would be 3 inches. 1.5 is 6 inches. 1.7 or 7.5 would be 8 inches. No, wait. 3, 6, 9 inches, sorry. And then, of course, 0 is your full 12. So, yeah, please don't go too crazy with that. There's no need to go past the first decimal place with really any of this. So move them closer. We'll save our CFG file, close this out again, and reopen it. Zoom right in, and we can see that, yeah, that's a lot closer now. I'm satisfied with that. Remember, there's no need to be spot on with it as long as you're close enough. As long as you're within it by, say, 5 inches to a foot, that's close enough for government work. So I'm going to define the next set of seats real quick off camera for you. Actually, I've decided, let me show you real quick how I do this. So the first row, we know that we can use the POH data here. So the first row is 73 or 173.9 inches aft. So 173.9 divided by 12 inches per foot, that's 14.4 feet back. So I'm going to set all of my passenger stations to empty, and I'm just going to set them to minus 14.4 for these first 3, as this is my first row of seats. As for their definitions, I'm going to set 1.5 minus 1.5 for this one. Now remember, you need to define all positions. The POH doesn't help you as much as it could because it defines the positions along the longitudinal axis, but not necessarily along the lateral axis. But you, as the developer of an airplane for flight sim, need to define all three axes, because weight and balance is not just about the longitudinal, it's also in the lateral and the vertical. So what am I thinking? Just 1.5 on this one, and probably let's go with 3.5 here, and we'll see how that looks. Save and reopen. Okay, so we got two of them too far over, none of them in the right spot relative to the model. And here's where some things can be different. As you may have noticed already, our seats are not quite lined up here like they are on this one. Also, we have more than what this one defines as. So that's kind of how you use the POH. But what's a far better option is using the visible 3D model. That way the payload stations match up the way they should. So let's do that. We see that our left row needs to move back and over some. So our left row, let's move it back another foot, and let's move it, actually no, that was, yeah, let's move that over another foot and move it back another foot as well. As for these are too far over, so let's just move this one over half a foot from the axis and move this one 2 feet from the axis. We save that, close this, and reopen it. And yeah, that looks a lot better. Still some fine-tuning to do. But that looks a lot, yeah, that's much better. Now again, remember, you can always shift and right-click to move into the model itself, if that is easier. Actually, I think the wireframe's a lot easier, especially when the seats are actually colored green for us. So we can see vertically, we might need to come up a little bit, but now we're close enough that we're good in the vertical. We just need to get the lateral and longitudinal positions down. So this one looks good. This one needs to be moved closer. Both of them need to be moved closer, and this one on the left needs to move back just a little bit more. So let's put this to 15.7. This one's fine, and this one needs to move back closer. Also, if I look, yeah, this one needs to move in too, so let's try 1.5. Save and reopen. Now, I'm doing 3 at a time because I know what I'm doing. I've done this enough times to be good enough to actually do that. I recommend for you new guys, just do 1 at a time. And here you can see much better positioning. Still need to move, this one needs to move back out, and so does that one. So let's move this one over to 1.7 and you over to 1.7 as well. Model viewer. There we go. That's a lot better. Still not 100% right. So let's just go to 1.9 on both of these. And I kind of think they all need to move back a little bit still. So let's increase them by another inch or two. Let's go to 14.8, 14.5, 14.5. Save, reload. And that's all there is to it. That really is all there is to it. You're just moving these dots around until you get them like they are now, right smack dab where you want them. Now, we are helped out by the fact that we can visibly see the seats. What if you can't visibly see the seats? Well, in that case, you kind of get a little bit more creative. You try to match up where the center of a particular payload station would be relative to plain things that you can see. By far, very helpful to have a map of the payload station or the payload map you're trying to model on hand. But yeah, in fact, I don't think you can really do this without a map of some kind to guide you. Now, I'm defining seats here. There's 12 passengers on this plane, plus 2 pilots and a cargo bay. And also down here, the underside cargo hold. Now, I don't recommend doing this for every plane because obviously with bigger planes, there's going to be more seats. If there's more than 10 passengers, typically I recommend doing a payload station, which combines multiple seats into one station, as opposed to doing each individual seat, because 10's about that number where people are going to stop caring about accuracy, because from the end user perspective, they have to enter the weight for each of these stations if they want to be accurate. So when you get more than 10 stations, it gets kind of a bother. So you can kind of get away with it on planes like this, even if there is a little bit more than 10 because they are so small. But yeah, 10 is about that number where you don't really want to go beyond. Now, I'm going to fill out the rest of these, and then we'll talk a little bit more after I've filled them all out. So real quick, let me do that. Alright, I have gone through the entire aircraft and made each and every station, so we've done with that. I've sort of split it off into sections here, so pilots, cabin, cargo pod, and that's all to make it easier for you viewers. And if I was distributing this, which I'm not, I probably would do that just to make it easier for the end user to understand. And that is really key. What I want to talk about real quick is naming. As you can see, I've already gone through and named each and every payload station. Real quick, you want to make sure that you set these numbers here, load station 2, 3, 4, set those in order, and make sure if you're doing this naming method where you have a separate name section instead of putting the name at the end of the data section here, make sure that these all correspond to what you want. So cargo pod zone A is on station 15. 15 is 11 after the datum and 3 under, which is right here on the cargo pod. Here's where all the stations are when everything is said and done. We have our 2 pilots, all 4 rows of passengers for 12 total. We have a cargo section here in the back. The Caravan actually does have a rear baggage bay right here. And of course we have the cargo pod down here with its 4 zones of cargo. I know it has 4 zones just from reading the POH. And these were all positioned how I showed you relative to where they are on the actual 3D model of the plane, not exactly where they lie on the POH. It's usually better to go with what is actually going to be done in the sim, not what the real-life aircraft does. You want to try to get the two to match as close as possible if you can, but you're not always going to be able to. So when in doubt, go with how the sim's going to have it, not with how reality has it. The other thing I want to talk about is naming. Now, we have 18 payload stations on this plane, and here's all their names. You want your names to be short and descriptive. There's no real character limit, I think, to this, but it's not going to show. There's a limited amount of room on the payload dialog, so you want these to be short. I actually think our cargo pod down here is going to be a little too long, so I'm actually going to combine cargo pod into one word. Now, how do you name these? Well, pilot and co-pilot is pretty obvious, but we want to make sure the end user knows that when they put weight in this particular station, they know exactly how that's going to affect the payload just by reading this name. So let's go. Row 1 left. Well, if I've looked at a 3D model of this plane, I would know that row 1 probably refers to passenger row 1, and left would be the left side seat. And looking at this, once we get in sim, we can clearly tell how the cabin configuration is, so this would make a lot more sense then. But how do we know which one's which row? Well, you start from the pilot seats, work your way back. That's typically the front of the plane towards the back, and the first row is obviously row 1, then row 2, 3, 4, and so on. The one that is a bit ambiguous would be the cargo ones, the cargo zone and the cargo pod. we know it's last. So if we go by our row nomenclature, it's probably in the back of the plane. Probably this big empty area back here is the cargo zone, or the cargo area. And we know the cargo pod is hung underneath the airplane. Zone A, B, and C, and D, if we use our row stuff again, Zone A would probably up to the front, Zone B up at somewhere in the middle, C and D, and they'd probably correspond to roughly where these doors are too, if you open the doors, which they don't open on this particular model. And you can see they actually do. They're kind of just behind the doors, except for cargo zone B. It's a little bit after the door. And that's pretty close. So yeah, make sure you got these numbered correctly, and make sure they are named in a way that makes sense. Don't get too crazy with it. Go with what makes sense and keep them short, sweet, to the point. That's my advice. Now, the last bit of the weight and balance here is the data I never touch, but I will go over it for the sake of this. These are the moments of inertia for pitch, roll, and yaw for an empty airplane. Now, if we read this, a moment of inertia defines the mass distribution about an axis of the aircraft. A moment of inertia for a particular axis is increased as mass increases and or as the given mass is distributed further from the axis. This is largely what determines the inertial characteristics of the aircraft. The following weight and balance parameters define moments of inertia of an empty aircraft, so the values should not reflect fuel, passengers, or baggage. The simulation engine determines that the total moments of inertia with these additional and variable influences, these units are slugs per foot squared. Omission of a parameter will result in the use of a default value set in the air file if one exists. These values can be estimated with the following formula. A moment of inertia equals empty weight times d squared divided by k, where d is the length wingspan or length plus wingspan for pitch, roll, and yaw respectively, and k is 810, 1870, and 770 for pitch, roll, and yaw respectively. So yeah, I don't normally ever mess with this. This is set by the developer. There is the formula in the SDK right here, which is moment of inertia equals empty weight times parentheses d squared divided by k, d being length if you're talking about pitch, wingspan if you're talking about roll, and yaw, and length plus wingspan if you're talking about yaw, multiple. And for yaw, it's 0.5 times length plus wingspan for the yaw. And K is either 810 for pitch, 1870 for roll, and 770 for yaw. That is how you calculate that. Now, there's one last thing in the weight and balance I want to go over. If you note, I've added two new lines up here above the station data, and that is CG forward limit and CG aft limit. This is where you can define the limits on the the longitudinal axis of the CG. So our forward limit is obviously the forward limit, how far forward is it allowed to go, and aft limit is how far aft it is allowed to go. So our empty weight CG position is minus 15.4, which puts it somewhere between station 4 and 5, which is row 1 and row 2. So if we look at our model, somewhere between row 1 and row 2, so right about here is where the empty weight, roughly a quarter of the way, about half the wingspan. So looking at this, you want to set the CG limits. Now, I don't know what the actual default is. Curiously enough, this particular thing not talked about in the SDK for some reason, but it is there. So you don't want to make this too narrow. Our POH can actually help us out here if we go back to the weight and balance data, which is 300 something, 344, I believe. we need to find what the limit is of our CG. So real quick, give me a second to read the POH. Let me see if I can find it. All right, here's the center of gravity diagram. You can find this in the aircraft POH for many airplanes. So here we can see the inches aft of datum CG limits, which is about 179, we'll just say 180 inches, and 200 to 205, we'll say 204. So if we divide that by 12 to get feet, 180 divided by 12 is 15, and 204 divided by 12 is 17. So our limits will be minus 15 and minus 17. Remember, we got to define it after the datum here. So our forward limit is minus 15, our aft limit minus 17, and if we look on the 3D model, let me go back to textured, that's going to be roughly here to here. So our CG has to fall somewhere on there, and that makes sense. You want your CG to fall somewhere on the wing root for most airplanes, because like I demonstrated in a Kerbal Space Program video, all the plane's movements are relative to the CG. It pitches, rolls, and yaws about the axes that go through the CG. So if the CG was way the heck back here, then the wings won't work right, nor will the tail or the rudder, and that's why you need to define these limits. Now, I would assume that if you don't define them, it will just default to somewhere within the wing root area, but I don't know for sure. And that there is weight and balance data. It's a little complicated, and I know it took a little while to explain, but that's pretty much it. And you saw how I did it, so just a quick recap. I positioned them relative to where they are on the model using my XYZ coordinates relative to the datum, and for usefulness, define where the datum is by putting one of these stations at 0 and getting rid of it when you're done. And that is the weight and balance data.
It goes, holy wow, that's a crosswind, holy cow. I wonder if I can pit maneuver you.